Right now, a man sits in a Spokane County jail cell on a $1 million bond, accused of starting a fire that erased 640 homes from the map in a single week. But that's only half the story. While that fire tore through neighborhoods, the planes trying to stop it kept getting pulled from the sky. Not by wind, not by smoke, but by ordinary people flying drones for a better view. Let that sink in for a second, because it sounds almost too strange to be real. A city burns. Air tankers and helicopters are the only thing standing between a wall of flame and a residential street. And over again, those aircraft had to turn around and fly away. Not because the fire got worse, but because someone's hobby drone wandered into the airspace above the smoke. At least 26 times. 26 separate moments where the single most effective tool against a runaway wildfire was taken off the board by a person holding a remote control and a phone, hoping to get a dramatic shot for social media. So this is the story of a disaster that, according to the people who fought it, never had to happen at all. Not the way it happened, not at the scale it happened. This is a story about a fire, yes, but it's really a story about choices. One man's alleged choice to strike a match in a dry field on a windy afternoon, and dozens of strangers' choices to send a drone into a sky where lives depended on it staying empty. Two very different kinds of decisions, made by people who probably never met each other, that together turned a bad wildfire season into the worst natural disaster the city of Spokane has ever recorded. Let's start with what we actually know, because in a story like this, the details matter more than the drama. On Saturday, August 1st, a fire broke out on the West Plains, a stretch of open land northwest of downtown Spokane. It's called the Old Trails Fire, and from the first hour it had almost everything working in its favor. Winds were gusting between 35 and 50 miles an hour. Humidity was sitting in the single digits. The grass and brush across the region were bone dry after a long, hot summer. In conditions like that, a fire doesn't creep, it runs. And this one ran straight for the Spokane River, jumped it, and kept going, pushing into the city itself and tearing through two residential areas known as Indian Trail and 5 Mile Prairie. By the time crews had any real handle on it, the numbers were almost impossible to process. 640 structures destroyed. That's homes, garages, businesses, the physical record of people's lives, gone. It was the single most destructive of 3 fires burning around Spokane that week. And together, those 3 fires leveled more than 700 buildings and forced roughly 67,000 people to evacuate. 67,000 people in a matter of hours, grabbing what they could and running. The mayor of Spokane didn't hedge when she described it. She called it the worst natural disaster the region has ever faced. For 2 days, that's exactly what it was understood to be. A natural disaster. A brutal, unlucky convergence of drought, wind, and dry fuel. The kind of thing nobody could have stopped and nobody could be blamed for. The kind of story that makes you shake your head at how cruel weather can be and then move on, because what else is there to do about the wind? Then, on the 3rd day, the story changed shape entirely. The break in the case didn't come from a forensic lab or a specialized fire investigation unit. It came from an ordinary person. According to Spokane County Sheriff John Knowles, a community member called in a tip. They reported seeing a man crouched by the side of the road, near some grass, in the area investigators believe is where the fire started. The witness described him as nervous-looking. That single observation from someone who happened to be in the right place at the wrong time became the thread that unraveled the rest of this story. Investigators followed that tip to a 37-year-old Spokane man. They brought him in for questioning, and in a detail that tells you a lot about how careful this process was, they released him afterward. No charges yet, no arrest, just a name and a growing file. The investigation didn't stop there, though. It kept going for 2 more days, quietly, out of public view, while the fire itself was still burning through neighborhoods. And then, on Monday, August 3rd, the Spokane County Sheriff's Office went back out, arrested him, and booked him on suspicion of first-degree arson in connection with the Old Trails fire. His bond was set at $1 million. I want you to sit with that sequence for a moment, because it's not just a timeline, it's actually a clue about the strength of the case. Questioned, released, then, days later, rearrested. That gap matters. Arson is one of the hardest crimes in the world to prove for a very simple and almost cruel reason. The evidence is, by definition, mostly destroyed by the very fire it's meant to prove. There's no knife with fingerprints on it. There's no security camera footage of the fire itself igniting in most cases. Investigators have to work backward from the point of origin, reading burn patterns like a language, looking for signs of an ignition source, cross-referencing witness accounts, and building a timeline precise enough to put one specific person at one specific spot at one specific moment. A tip about a nervous man crouched near dry grass at the suspected point of origin is the kind of thread that starts an investigation. It is not, on its own, usually enough to end one with an arrest. The fact that the sheriff's office let him go and then came back with a warrant, suggests that in those intervening days, they built something more solid. What that additional evidence actually is, we don't know publicly yet. That will come out, if it comes out at all, in court filings and at trial. Here's where I have to hold the line very carefully, and I'd ask you to hold it with me, because it's the responsible way to tell a story like this. An arrest is not a conviction. A charge is not proof. The man now sitting in that jail cell is accused of starting this fire. He has not stood trial. Under the law, he is presumed innocent until a court says otherwise, and that presumption isn't a technicality, it's the whole foundation of how this is supposed to work. It's entirely possible the case against him is airtight. It's also entirely possible it falls apart under scrutiny. We don't have access to the evidence file. What we have right now is an arrest and a charge, and those are two very specific, very limited things. What we can say, factually, is this. Authorities believe the Old Trail's fire was not simply an accident of nature. They believe a specific person deliberately set it, and they have charged someone with doing exactly that. It's also worth noting that this allegation applies only to the Old Trail's fire, the largest of the three, the one responsible for those 640 destroyed homes. Investigators have not announced a cause for the other two fires that burned alongside it. So whatever happened here, it may not be the whole story of that week in Spokane. It might just be the first chapter of it. Now think about why that one word, arson, changes the entire emotional shape of this disaster. Because that's really the heart of what makes this story worth telling. Up until the moment of that arrest, Spokane's fire was a tragedy in the purest sense, a terrible blind convergence of drought and wind and dry fuel, the kind of disaster nobody could point a finger at. It's the sort of event that generates grief without anger, because there's no one to be angry at. You can be furious at a summer. You can't really be furious at a summer the way you can be furious at a person. An arson allegation reframes every part of that. If the accusation against this man holds up, then every one of those 640 homes, every one of the 67,000 people who fled with whatever they could carry, every family standing in ash trying to find a piece of jewelry or a photograph, all of it traces back not to a bolt of lightning or a downed power line, but to a decision. A choice made by one person, and that is a fundamentally different kind of weight to carry, both for the victims and for the community trying to make sense of what happened to it. There's a couple worth mentioning here, because their story is the human center of all of this. Daniel and Miriam Sim, both in their 70s, returned on the Monday after the fire to what used to be their home. They'd lived there since 2005, 2 decades of mornings and holidays and ordinary life inside those walls. When they arrived, there was nothing left to salvage. Miriam said so plainly there was nothing left to save. And her husband asked a question that a lot of older residents across Spokane are quietly asking themselves right now. At our age, do we want to rebuild? If this fire was purely an act of nature, that question is heartbreaking in a clean, simple way. There's no villain in it, just loss and exhaustion and the practical math of starting over in your 70s. But if the fire was set on purpose, that same exact question suddenly has a person standing at the end of it, someone whose alleged decision took a home that 2 people had spent 20 years inside of. That's why arson cases hit differently than accidental fires. It's not only about the scale of the damage, it's the sense that the damage was allegedly unnecessary, that none of it had to happen at all, that on a different day, with a different person walking past that dry field, the Sims would still be sitting on their porch tonight. But the man accused of striking that first spark is only half of why this fire grew into the catastrophe it became. The other half happened somewhere entirely different. It happened in the sky. And it involves people who almost certainly meant no harm whatsoever, which somehow makes it even harder to sit with. Here's the part of this story that made me genuinely angry when I first read through the reporting on it, and I suspect it'll land the same way for you, because it is so completely avoidable. While these fires were burning at their absolute worst, unauthorized drones entered the restricted airspace over the Spokane fire zone at least 26 times. And every single one of those times, fire officials had to make the same brutal call: ground the aircraft. To understand why that rule exists and why it's non-negotiable, you have to understand what firefighting aircraft are actually doing during a wildfire. Air tankers and helicopters fly low, sometimes barely above the treetops, moving fast through thick smoke, dropping water or fire retardant with a level of precision that leaves almost no margin for error. Now put a civilian drone into that same stretch of sky, a drone that the pilot cannot see coming, that isn't on any flight plan, that could be anywhere from ground level to several thousand feet up. A collision between a drone and an aircraft in that environment isn't a minor incident. It can bring down a helicopter or an air tanker entirely, killing the crew inside and destroying a piece of equipment the entire firefighting operation depends on. Because the stakes are that absolute, the rule is equally absolute. If there is an unauthorized drone anywhere in that airspace, every single aircraft stops flying immediately until officials are certain the sky is clear again. Now, think about what that actually means in practice. in the middle of a fire that is moving house to house through a city. Air tankers are often the only thing capable of slowing a fire's advance into a neighborhood that ground crews simply cannot reach in time, whether because of terrain, traffic, or the sheer speed of the flames. Every single minute those aircraft sit grounded, the fire keeps moving with absolutely nothing above it to check its progress. And a drone doesn't need to actually strike anything to cause real damage. Its mere presence in that airspace is enough, on its own, to take the single most effective firefighting tool completely off the table. 26 separate times, over a fire that was consuming homes by the hour. And here's the detail that makes this even worse than it first appears. Grounding an aircraft isn't like flipping a switch. It's not instant on, instant off. When a drone is spotted, the response isn't a 60-second pause while it drifts out of view. Aircraft have to divert away from the area entirely. In many cases, they return all the way to base, and they don't resume low-level drops until officials are genuinely confident that the airspace is clear, not just for the moment, but reliably. A single drone sighting can cost far more time than the few seconds it was actually visible in the sky. It can cost the better part of an hour of aerial firefighting, at exactly the moment when a fire is at its most aggressive and most dangerous. Now multiply that lost hour by 26, layered across the precise window when Spokane's neighborhoods were burning fastest, and you start to get a real sense of how much unchecked fire growth those incursions may have allowed to happen. Here's the thing that makes this whole situation so strange to sit with. The people flying those drones almost certainly were not trying to help the fire along. Most drone incursions over active wildfires come from a much more mundane place than sabotage. They come from spectators, hobbyists, people who wanted dramatic footage for their own accounts, who saw smoke on the horizon and thought about the shot before they thought about the consequences. But here's the uncomfortable truth underneath all of that. Intention doesn't matter to the outcome. Whether you send a drone over a burning neighborhood out of malice or out of simple curiosity, the result on the ground is identical. The planes come down, the fire wins that window. Nobody up in a cockpit or down in an evacuated neighborhood gets to know or care why the drone was there. They only experience the consequence of it being there at all. This problem is common enough and dangerous enough that the National Interagency Fire Center runs an entire public safety campaign built around it, with a slogan that says, "Everything you need to know in exactly 4 words. If you fly, we can't." It's blunt because it needs to be. Flying a drone into wildfire-restricted airspace isn't just reckless. It's a federal crime, punishable by up to a year in prison, and it can carry a civil penalty of $20,000 or more. This isn't a hypothetical deterrent either. In California, fire investigators have actually tracked down and arrested hobbyists for doing exactly this. One man was identified after he posted his own drone footage of a wildfire to social media, essentially turning himself in through his own content, and he became the first person that state's fire agency ever arrested, specifically for grounding aircraft with a drone. So in Spokane, you end up with 2 very different kinds of accountability sitting side by side. On one hand, allegedly, one person accused of deliberately starting the fire that destroyed 640 homes. On the other hand, dozens of unnamed, mostly anonymous people, whose choices were careless rather than criminal in intent, but who kept grounding the aircraft trying to fight it anyway. A disaster made worse from 2 completely different directions at once, by people who almost certainly never crossed paths with one another. Now step back for a second, because neither of these problems is unique to Spokane, and understanding that is exactly why this story matters to you, no matter where you live. Wildfire arson is far more common than most people assume. Go back to 2024 and the Park Fire in California, the largest wildfire that state saw that entire year. It burned more than 429,000 acres and destroyed over 700 structures. It was allegedly started when a man pushed a burning car into a dry gully. Investigators across the country trace a meaningful share of the most destructive wildfires back to human ignition of one kind or another, some accidental, some deliberate. And here's the terrifying part of that fact. When a landscape is already primed to burn, when you've got dry fuel, low humidity, and strong wind all lined up at once, it genuinely does not take much to set off a catastrophe. A single spark, a dragging trailer chain, a rolling car, a match in the wrong field on the wrong afternoon. That's the fragility hiding underneath every Western summer. The difference between a quiet, uneventful evening and a 640-home catastrophe can come down to one person's choice, in one dry field on one particular day. None of that erases the presumption of innocence this man is still owed under the law, but it does explain why prosecutors and residents alike are treating this case with such weight, and why so many eyes across the region are now fixed on how it unfolds in court over the coming months. And the drone problem is only getting worse, precisely because drones have become so cheap and so common. A capable camera drone now costs less than a decent phone, and nearly anyone can own one. Every major wildfire in the country now draws them, without exception. Every fire agency across the American West is fighting some version of the same battle, trying to keep spectators in their aircraft out of restricted skies while their own aircraft are trying to do the actual work of saving homes. The Spokane fires alone drew at least 26 recorded incursions in a matter of days. California has logged dozens of similar incidents over the past several fire seasons. As long as people want that dramatic shot for their feed, and as long as a drone remains cheaper and more accessible than ever, this is going to keep happening. And every time it does, it will keep grounding the exact planes that entire neighborhoods are depending on to survive the day. Here's why all of this reaches you directly, wherever you happen to be watching this from. If you live at the edge of a western town, or increasingly at the edge of a lot of towns across the country now, where the last street on your block backs up against dry grass or brush, you are living somewhere that a single ignition on a windy August afternoon can turn into an evacuation order for your own street by that evening. And if that fire does come for your neighborhood, the aircraft trying to fight it can only do their job if the airspace above them stays clear. Two things that might sound like someone else's problem entirely. A stranger with a match in a field somewhere, a hobbyist with a drone somewhere else, are actually two of the biggest factors in whether a fire near you stays survivable or turns into a catastrophe. There's a simple, concrete way you fit into this story, and honestly, it might be the single most useful thing in this entire video. If you ever see a drone flying over or near an active wildfire, call 911. That's the official guidance from fire agencies, not a suggestion, an actual instruction. You making that call could be the exact thing that gets the air tankers back into the sky over someone's burning neighborhood minutes sooner than they otherwise would be. And it should go without saying, but I'll say it anyway. Never fly a drone yourself anywhere near an active fire. If you fly, we can't isn't a catchy slogan. In Spokane, it was 26 separate windows where the fire was allowed to run completely unchecked. So here's where things actually stand, as of this recording, and the threads that are still open. The three fires burning around Spokane, Old Trails, Fairview, and Autumn Lane had scorched roughly 16 square miles by early Tuesday, and at last report they were still completely uncontained. More than 1,000 firefighters, many of them brought in from out of state, had already arrived on scene, with that number expected to double in the days ahead. Calmer winds and slightly lower temperatures moved in and gave crews a genuine window to work with. But forecasters were already warning that hot, dry conditions were expected to return by midweek, conditions that could reawaken fires crews had only just started to get a handle on. Smoke had spread across nearly the entire state of Washington and was expected to linger in the air for days to come. This is already being called the Pacific Northwest's worst fire season in more than 30 years. There is, remarkably, still no confirmed loss of life connected to these fires, which, in a disaster that destroyed roughly 700 buildings, is close to miraculous, and it's a genuine credit to how fast and how thoroughly those evacuation orders went out. The man accused of starting the Old Trails fire remains in custody on that $1 million bond, and his case will now move through the court system, where the allegation against him will either be proven beyond a reasonable doubt or it won't. Authorities are still actively investigating the cause of the other two fires, which means it's entirely possible this story isn't finished yet. There may be more to learn about how all three of these fires actually began, and that's really the thread I want to leave you with tonight. For 2 full days, Spokane's disaster was understood as a natural one, something that simply happened to a city, the kind of event nobody could be blamed for. Then an arrest turned it into something a specific person now stands accused of doing to that city. And running underneath the entire thing the whole time was a quieter scandal, aircraft grounded again and again, not by nature, not by wind or smoke, but by people who simply wanted a better view for themselves. The 640 homes are gone either way. The 67,000 people who evacuated did so either way. What the arrest and the drone incursions add to this story is the hardest part to actually sit with. The growing, uncomfortable sense that the worst part of this disaster may not have been the weather at all. It may have been us. Keep the people of Spokane in mind tonight. The families who lost absolutely everything. The crews still out there fighting a fire that remains uncontained as we speak. And a couple in their 70s, standing in the ashes of 20 years, trying to decide whether they have it in them to start over one more time. And if you're ever standing somewhere and you see a drone flying over a wildfire, do the one simple thing that actually helps. Call 911. Take care of each other out there.